अस्सलाम वालेकुम जी। ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी लेक्चर नंबर 28। अब तक आप ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी का आधे से ज़्यादा हिस्सा पढ़ चुके हैं and hopefully you are reviewing whatever we are talking about on your television sets. If you continue to review, then you are halfway, more than halfway through the course, and it will not become a burden at the end of the day. We are going to touch upon communication again today. पिछली मर्तबे हमने कम्युनिकेशन के बारे में कुछ नई बातें सीखी थी और आज कुछ और बातें देखेंगे। लेकिन इससे पहले कि हम आगे चलें और आज का लेसन देखें, let us first review what we had talked about in lecture number 27 related to communication. मैंने आपसे गुजारिश की थी कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी में कम्युनिकेशन का इजहार का एक बहुत गहरा ताल्लुक है और इस रेफरेंस में हमने बताया था कि इफेक्टिवनेस ऑफ एन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इज क्लोजली रिलेटेड टू द इफेक्टिवनेस ऑफ कम्युनिकेशन इन दैट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन। हमने आपको बताया था कम्युनिकेशन इज एक्सचेंज ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन थ्रू सिंबल्स। हमने आपको बताया था कि कम्युनिकेशन में दो अहम माइलस्टोन्स हैं जिनका जिक्र हमने किया था, एंड दैट वाज द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ गैंगप्लैंक पुट फॉरवर्ड बाय हेनरी फ्योल, हु सेड दैट कम्युनिकेशन शुड यूज द प्रोसीजर, द मेथड ऑफ गैंगप्लैंक। जो जिससे चाहे उसको कम्युनिकेट करने की इजाजत और रूल्स होने चाहिए। और दूसरा हमने जिक्र किया था माइलस्टोन कम्युनिकेशन से मुतल्लिक दूसरे शख्स का, चेस्टर बर्नार्ड, हु हैड सेड कि कम्युनिकेशन को बेहतर करने के लिए 4-6 चीज़ें आपको ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में करनी चाहिए कि कम्युनिकेशन डायरेक्ट हो, शॉर्ट हो, ऑथेंटिकेटेड हो, चैनल शुड बी नोन टू एवरीबॉडी, चैनल शुड नॉट बी इंटरप्टेड। ये बातें हमने पिछले लेक्चर में माइलस्टोन्स की हैसियत से आपको बताई थी। फिर हमने बताया था कि मॉडर्न ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो है उसमें आप यूं समझ लीजिए कि 4 लेवल्स हैं या 2 टाइप्स हैं, फॉर्मल एंड इनफॉर्मल एंड ह्यूमनिस्टिक एंड मैकेनिस्टिक। फिर हमने बताया था आपको कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में हमारे पास मुख्तलिफ किस्म के ज़राए अवेलेबल हैं कम्युनिकेशन के। कम्युनिकेशन टेक्नोलॉजी, वी टॉक्ड अबाउट MIS, we talked about TT, then we talked about interpersonal communication, and then we talked about non-verbal communication, communication that is carried out by gestures, by tones. और ये हमारा लेक्चर जो था नॉन वर्बल कम्युनिकेशन पे आके ख़त्म हुआ था। अब इसको आगे बढ़ाते हैं कम्युनिकेशन को और देखते हैं कि और क्या क्या चीज़ें हैं कम्युनिकेशन से मुतल्लिक जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में असरअंदाज हो सकती हैं। इस रेफरेंस में पहली बात जो आपको देखनी है वो है द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन। ये डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन क्या होगी भाई? देखें, इसको समझने के लिए आपको पहले एक थोड़ा सा बैकग्राउंड में जाना होगा। अगर हम एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का जायजा लें तो हम देखेंगे कि वो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो है वो एक मुस्ततील की सूरत में होती है। इट इज लाइक ए ट्रायंगल। ट्रायंगल, देर आर मोर पीपल डाउन, देन देर आर लेस पीपल ऑन हायर लेवल, एंड देर आर सर्टनली लेस पीपल देन हायर लेवल, एंड देर आर even less people at the highest level. So if you were to represent an organization in the form of a geometrical figure, it will be a triangle. एक मुस्ततील या त्रिकोण की शक्ल उसकी होती है। तो वो कम्युनिकेशन जो मुस्ततील या ट्रायंगल में ऊपर से आए नीचे की तरफ, that would be called downward communication. Any organization has various types of communication in it. The first of these is downward communication, communication that emanates, that begins, that starts from the top and is filtered through goes to the bottom. जो ऑर्डर्स पास होते हैं, जो डिसीजंस लिए जाते हैं और उन डिसीजंस पे बेस्ड जो ऑर्डर्स हैं, दैट इज एन एग्जांपल ऑफ ए डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन. Downward communication is that communication which starts from the top and which is meant for the people down below in the organization. एक तो ये बात जहन में रखिए. दूसरी बात डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन से रिलेटेड जो है वो ये है कि इसके लिए आमतौर पर फॉर्मल तरीका इख्तियार किया जाता है, मैकेनाइज्ड तरीका इख्तियार किया जाता है. मैंने आपको बताया था पिछले लेक्चर में फॉर्मल और मैकेनाइज्ड कम्युनिकेशन जो है वो क्या है एज अपोज टू इनफॉर्मल एंड ह्यूमन. डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन इज यूजुअली फॉर्मल. इट इज इन द form of notices, it is in the form of newsletters, it is in the form of gazettes, it is in the form of email messages, it is in the form of hotlines. ये तमाम चीज़ें जो हैं ये डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन का हिस्सा हैं और ये फॉर्मल और मैकेनाइज्ड होती है. If you look at the psychology of downward communication, you would see that downward communication is usually ignored. लोग नोटिस नहीं पढ़ते, लोग नोटिस बोर्ड्स पे ध्यान नहीं देते, लोग गैजेट्स नहीं पढ़ते, लोग न्यूज लेटर्स नहीं पढ़ते. It is usually ignored. This is the psychology. Then it is misunderstood, badly used. People do not understand completely and utterly the spirit of what is conveyed in downward communication. ये बातें इसकी डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन की साइकोलॉजी का हिस्सा हैं. इनको अगर आप मद्देनजर रखें तो हाउ वुड यू इंप्रूव कम्युनिकेशन विच इज डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन? Psychologists related to organizations have identified a number of ways in which the downward communication can be improved. वो कम्युनिकेशन, वो बातें जो अफसरान बाला अपने मातहतों को बताना चाहते हैं वो आम तौर पर इग्नोर किए जाते हैं, उनको बुरी तरह से समझा जाता है, उन पर ध्यान नहीं दिया जाता. ये साइकोलॉजी है डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन की. तो इसको जब आप समझ गए कि ये साइकोलॉजी है तो फिर इसको इम्प्रूव करने के क्या तरीके हैं, उसमें 2-3 बातें अगर आप समझ लें तो ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट की हैसियत से आप डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन को बेहतर बना पाएंगे. ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट सजेस्ट दैट डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन कैन बी इम्प्रूव्ड, नंबर 1, by keeping in view that people accept those messages which are consonant to their values, which are of their own interests. Those messages or those contents of communication which are incongruent or inconsistent with their held values, they ignore. They do not take them into view. So if downward communication needs to be improved, one thing that has to be kept in mind is that the communication should be in consonance with the held values, belief systems of the people in the organization. एक और बात जो है कम्युनिकेशन को, डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन को बेहतर बनाने के लिए वो ये है कि आप जानते हैं, माहिर नफ्सियात की हैसियत से आपको जानना चाहिए that need fulfilling messages are usually accepted. Those patterns, those contents of communication which are directly related to the needs of the people and are fulfilling, are needs satisfying, those contents of the messages and communication are accepted. So if you want to improve downward communication, note that that should be related to the needs of the people and it should be need fulfilling. Another thing that you have to keep in mind while you are trying to improve downward communication is that people usually take the least path to resistance. When you want to convey something as an organizational psychologist and that communication involves downward communication, you should be sure that people would ignore it, because people usually follow the path of least resistance. So if the information is tailored in such a way that it presents least resistance to the people, if language is simple, if it is related to the needs of the people, if it is repeated again and again, then that communication would be easily accepted by the people down below. This is how downward communication may be improved. Downward communication का मकसद क्या है? Why do organizations have downward communication? There are 4 or 5 purposes that downward communication serves. Number 1, that it gives directives. It tells the people in the organization what is to be done, how is it to be done. It provides direction and directives. That's one of the main purposes. Another purpose of downward communication is that it provides relevant information. It tells you how, it tells the people how much work was supposed to have done and how much is it done, and how that work may possibly be done. What are the possible barriers in the achievement of the organizational goals, and how those barriers may be removed. This is another purpose, that it gives information. Another purpose of downward communication is that it provides feedback. आपको याद आया feedback क्या है? Feedback is knowledge of results. Research has shown that knowledge of results is critically related to the performance of a person. That knowledge of results is critically related to the overall organizational effectiveness. अब इस knowledge of results से क्या मतलब है? अगर organization में लोगों को ये पता चलता रहे on an ongoing basis, how are they performing? How well are they performing? What is wrong in their performance? How that wrong may be corrected? Whether or not that wrong has been corrected? And if that wrong has been corrected, how far has it been corrected? All of these are examples of feedback or knowledge of results. इस ज़िम्न में मैं आपसे एक एक्सपेरिमेंट का भी जिक्र करना चाहूंगा. बच्चों पे जो एक्सपेरिमेंट्स किए गए हैं related to education, related to their school subjects, those experiments have shown that those children who were informed of how well or how badly were they performing in their educational pursuits did better, much better than those children who were not informed as to how well or how badly were they performing in their educational pursuits. मिसाल के तौर पर एक रिसर्च में देखा गया कि बच्चों को रियाजी के सवाल हल करने को कहा गया, और वो बच्चे जिन्होंने रियाजी के सवाल हल किए उनको बताया गया कि तुमने 10 में से 6 या 7 या 8 सवाल सही हल किए. एक और ग्रुप को वही रियाजी के सवाल हल करने को कहा गया, लेकिन उनको बताया नहीं गया कि तुमने कितने सवाल दुरुस्त किए हैं. और जब इन दोनों ग्रोहों का मुवाजना किया गया आपस में, when the comparison was carried out between group A arithmetic ability and group B's arithmetical ability, research showed that those children who were informed of their results of how well they were performing in solving arithmetical problems, those children fared much better than those children who were not informed. यही चीज हमने ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी में भी देखी है. Those workers who are informed of how are they performing at their jobs perform better than those workers who are not informed about how well or badly they are performing at their jobs. And this knowledge of results, this knowledge of how well or badly are they performing is called feedback. So feedback in education or in organizational psychology has a very vital role to play. And the vital role to play of feedback is determined by downward communication. It is the duty of the people at the top to provide feedback. And if it is provided at the right time, then feedback can improve the effectiveness, the productivity, the job satisfaction of the people in the organization. But remember, when downward communication takes place, it is usually ignored. And that is the crux. That is the crux. The purpose of the downward communication is to provide feedback. And that is why it must be provided in such a way that it is not ignored, that it is related to the needs of the people. And that is one of the most important purposes of downward communication, providing feedback. एक और अहम पर्पस जो है डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन का ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में वो है दैट इट गिव्स द आइडियोलॉजिकल विजन, द आइडियोलॉजिकल बेसिस ऑफ द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन. आप कहेंगे कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का भी कोई आइडियोलॉजिकल बेसिस है? बिल्कुल होता है. हर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में एक मिशन स्टेटमेंट होती है, वेदर दैट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इज ए प्रोडक्ट रिलेटेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन or a service-related organization. There is always a mission statement of the organization. We will produce the best comfortable shoes at an affordable price in the market. That would be the mission statement of an organization that produces shoes. We would provide the best educational facilities so that when students join us and when they join and when they leave our organization, they are honest citizens and well-informed managers in organizations. That could be the mission statement of an educational institution. अब हर educational institution या हर product organization की एक mission statement होती है. It's like the North Star, the guiding principle by which all organizations happen to function. The purpose of downward organization communication is to clarify that mission statement, is to translate that mission statement into words and into deeds and acts. And that is the purpose of downward communication. अब आप खुद अंदाज़ा लगाइए कि if the purpose of downward communication is to provide the people in the organization with the ideological basis, with the mission statement of the organization, how important downward communication is. And also compare that if downward communication, as we just noted, if it is ignored, how damaging it possibly could be. That is why downward communication has to be studied very carefully and made sure by organizational psychologists that it is improved upon, that people listen to it, that people act upon it, that people become a part of that downward communication and take it in letter and spirit. That is what downward communication is. इसके अलावा भी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में एक और कम्युनिकेशन है. मैंने आपसे अभी गुजारिश की थी कि अगर आप एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का ग्राफ बनाएंगे तो वो एक मुसल्लस की सूरत में होगा. It would look like a triangle. I just told you the basis for that also. Of course, this is a hypothetical example that we are talking about. But generally speaking, an organization could be described or could be represented by in the figure of a triangle, because there are more people down below, less people in between, and still less people in between, and still very small number of people at the top. So it is like a pyramid or a triangle. So the communication that flows from the top and comes to the bottom is downward communication. But that is not the only communication that takes place in an organization. There is communication that emanates, that begins from the bottom and goes to the top. So we have this other kind of communication in the organization, which we call upward communication. Upward communication emanating, starting from the lower rungs of the organization, let us say from the labor, the peons, the sweepers of the organization, and that moves towards the upper echelons of the organization. And that is what is called upward communication. Upward communication has certain problems also. People are self-conscious. They do not express themselves. They are afraid. They are full of fear. They lack necessary communicating technologies. They lack certain ways and means of expressing themselves. These are all problems that upward communication suffers from. So, what would you suggest as an organizational psychologist to improve upon upward communication in an organization? क्या upward communication ऐसे improve होगी that no doors are open to people to communicate, या upward communication ऐसे improve होगी that all employees could easily talk to anyone that they needed to, wanted to talk to, communicate to? Obviously, by the second method. So, one of the ways in which you could help to improve upward communication is that employees should be allowed to appeal, to talk, to communicate beyond their immediate bosses. Why would that improve upward communication? Because, as I said earlier, if doors are open, if organization follows an open door policy, then communication that begins from the lower rungs of the organization would be more facilitated. Let me give you an example on this one. A boss is dissatisfied with his colleague in an organization. The colleague feels that he is fully carrying out his duty to the best of his abilities, but the boss is still dissatisfied. What should the employee do? Who were to settle that issue? If the employee can only communicate to his boss, and if he is not allowed by the rules and regulations of the organization to talk to the boss of the boss, then that communication coming from the bottom going towards the top would be stifled, would be hindered. And that is one way in which communication that comes from the lower rungs of the organization and goes to the upper rungs of the organization can be improved if the employees are allowed within the parameters, within the framework, within the rules and regulations of the organization to talk to the boss of the boss. That's one way. Another way is that all bosses, all people who have some other people under their control, under their command, should follow an open door policy. Open door policy kya hai? That anybody could talk to anybody else at any time on any topic related to organizational success and organizational goals and organizational functioning. If bosses, if anybody who commands certain people under him, if he practices open door policy, upward communication would be facilitated. Another way in which upward communication could be facilitated would be to provide people the opportunity to be a part of the decision-making process. We'll talk about decision-making in subsequent lectures, but for the time being, decision-making is a very important element in any given organization. मिसाल के तौर पर कितना कपड़ा बनाया जाएगा, वर्किंग आवर्स क्या होंगे। मिसाल के तौर पर एक्सीडेंट की सूरत में एक्सीडेंट का जो खुदा न खास्ता शिकार हुआ है शख्स, उसको हेल्प कितनी मिलेगी। ये इस किस्म की जितनी पॉलिसीज हैं, इफ ऑल ऑफ दीज आर पार्टिसिपेटिव, if all of these involve people from the lower rungs to become part of those decisions, then that would help to improve upward communication. People down below in the lower rungs of the organization would understand that they were part of the decision-making process. Therefore, they would feel that decision, since they were part of the decision-making process, they have a right to convey whatever they want to convey related to the organizational decision to the bosses, to everybody else. एक और चीज अपवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन को इंप्रूव करने की जो आजकल मॉडर्न ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस इस्तेमाल कर रही हैं, वो है द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ ऑम्बड्समैन या ऑम्बड्स पर्सन। जरूरी नहीं है कि वो मैन हो। ऑम्बड्समैन क्या है? somebody who's been selected or chosen by consensus, by making all people a part of the decision-making process. He or she is appointed as somebody who would listen to everybody else's complaints and everybody else's ideas. And that ombudsman or ombudsperson then conveys those ideas to the relevant people. Creation of an ombudsperson in an organization is another way in which upward communication in an organization can be improved. एक और बात जिसके जरिए से organizational communication, particularly upward communication, can be improved is that managers or bosses need to develop listening skills. आप मेरी बात समझ रहे हैं? लिसनिंग स्किल्स आप तो समझते होंगे। सुनने के लिए स्किल की क्या जरूरत है? वेल, देयर आर कोर्सेज, देयर आर वर्कशॉप्स स्पेशली डिजाइन्ड विच ट्रेन पीपल टू बिकम बेटर एट लिसनिंग स्किल्स। लिसनिंग, ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी हैज डिस्कवर्ड, is a skill. सुनना भी एक स्किल है ना? अजीब बात। हम तो ऐसे समझ रहे हैं कि चाहे ना चाहे हम सुनते चले जाएंगे। जी हाँ, ऐसा है, लेकिन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में अगर कम्युनिकेशन इंप्रूव करनी है और अगर कम्युनिकेशन खास तौर पे अपवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन को इंप्रूव करना है, तो वो लोग जो हायर एशलॉन्स में हैं, जो हायर पोजीशंस पे हैं, मैनेजरियल पोजीशंस पे हैं, उनके लिए निहायत जरूरी है कि वो अपनी लिसनिंग स्किल्स को बेहतर करें। और लिसनिंग स्किल्स को बेहतर करने के तरीके भी मालूम है। मैं कुछ तरीके आपसे गुजारिश कर देता हूं। जब आप मास्टर्स लेवल पे पहुंचेंगे या अगर आप कभी साइकोथेरेपी में ट्रेन करना चाहेंगे, काउंसलिंग साइकोलॉजी में ट्रेन करना चाहेंगे, तो लिसनिंग स्किल्स के तरीकों पे आपको खास तवज्जो देनी होगी। कुछ साइको एनालिस्ट्स इसको लिसनिंग विद थर्ड ईयर भी कहते हैं। तीसरे कान से सुनना। अल्लाह ताला ने तो हमें 2 कान इनायत किए हैं, लेकिन तीसरे कान से सुनना इज अ टर्मिनोलॉजी which refers to development of the ability to listen to other people with rapt attention. So one of the important ways of improving upward communication that starts from the bottom, from the lower rungs of the organization and goes to the higher rungs of the organization, involves development of listening skills on the part of the managers. अब वो कैसे करें वो भी देख लेते हैं। उसके लिए भी कुछ चीजें हैं, कुछ requirements हैं. Number 1, listening skills can be improved if a manager maintains attention. Attention maintain करने से listening जो है वो बेहतर हो जाती है. Attention maintain करने से वो शख्स जो कम्युनिकेट कर रहा है वो बेहतर तरह से कम्युनिकेट करेगा मैनेजर के साथ. और क्योंकि मैनेजर इज एट ए हायर पोजीशन and the communicator, the sender, is a lower position. Therefore, this is a paradigm of upward communication. So, if attention is being maintained by the manager to listen to the person, that maintained attention would improve the listening skill of the person and therefore would help upward communication. एक और तरीका है लिसनिंग स्किल को इंप्रूव करने का, दैट इज टू शो एम्पैथी. जब हम पॉजिटिव साइकोलॉजी का जिक्र कर रहे थे आपसे, तो हमने एम्पैथी का जिक्र भी किया था. एम्पैथी इज showing the other people, showing the other person what he feels, you feel the same way. You should not confuse empathy with sympathy. Sympathy is hamdardi. You don't improve upward communication if you show sympathy. You improve upward communication if you show empathy by improving your listening skill. What is empathy? Putting yourself in the position of the other person and feeling like the other person. And that is empathy. मैंने आपको बताया था कि J.L. Moreno ने जो एक टेक्नोलॉजी बनाई है ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ साइकोलॉजिकल डिजीजेस, that was called psychodrama. One of the ways of psychodrama was, I told you, role reversal. That a person may adopt the role of another person and thereby put himself in the shoes of the other person. When you put yourself in the shoes of another person, you are empathizing with him or her. And that is what is empathy. When you put yourself in the position of the other person who is the sender, who is communicating, that empathy improves your listening skill. That makes the other person open up and say whatever he wants to say. So one of the ways in which listening can be improved is to become empathetic, to reverse your roles with the other person. Another way in which you could improve your listening skill is to draw out the other person. Draw out the other person means that you make him feel comfortable with whatever he wants to say or she wants to say. He should not get the feeling that whatever he is going to say or whatever she is going to say, you are not going to like it or you're switched off. If he gets the feeling that the listener is not listening to him, if the talker, communicator gets the impression that whatever the sender is going to say, that is not going to be well received by the receiver, that is the end of listening skill. Listening skill is the ability to be able to draw the other person, the ability to listen to him and to keep listening and to keep asking relevant questions so that the other person has the opportunity to say more and more in what he or she wants to say. Drawing out, therefore, is another way in which listening skill can be improved. Listening skill can also be improved by using restatement. आपका मतलब है आप ये कहना चाह रहे हैं, and then the other person of course goes on. So when he is or she is almost done, you restate what he or she has said, and that gives the other person the impression that you are really listening to him, and that encourages the other person to open up his heart to you. And that's another example of listening skill. और एक आखिरी बात जो लिसनिंग स्किल के बारे में मैं आपसे गुजारिश करना चाहूंगा वो है the ability to know when to keep quiet. When somebody is talking, you should, as a listener, not only give attention, maintain attention, use statement, be empathetic. draw him out, you should also know when to keep quiet. It seems very simple, but silence can be very unnerving. If there are two people sitting across the table and one of them belongs to the lower rung and the other person belongs to the higher rung in an organization, and if there is silence between the two, both of them would become very nervous. A good manager, a person who has high listening skills, is not afraid of silence between two people, can keep quiet, and that helps to draw the other person. That helps to get the message to the other person, a non-verbal message to the other person, that the listener is really empathetic, that the listener really wants to listen to what the speaker is going to say. These are some of the uses of listening skills, and these are some of the ways in which listening skills can be developed. Listening skills are closely related to the improvement of upward communication. If listening skills are developed, then upward communication would improve. If listening skills, if a manager or an officer lacks listening skills, then upward communication would be discouraged. तो ये है upward और downward communication. इसके अलावा भी एक और किस्म की communication है मॉडर्न ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में, जिसका अमल अब बढ़ता चला जा रहा है ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में, and that is interactive communication. Communication that is neither upward nor downward, but is interactive. That is, it takes place at an equal level. Most of the communication in organizations, it would be either upward or downward. But some communication in the organization, particularly the modern organizations, is interactive communication. Why am I saying that in modern organizations? Because modern organizations are now becoming more and more flat. वो जो मैंने गुजारिश की थी ना आपसे कि वो पिरामिड का एक शक्ल है ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस की, वो अब 21वीं सदी की ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में कम होती चली जा रही हैं. ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस आर बिकमिंग मोर एंड मोर फ्लैटेंड. ये हमने आपसे पहले भी कहा था. वो अब हॉरिजॉन्टल, वो अब वर्टिकल कम रह रही हैं, उनकी वर्टिकलिटी कम हो रही है, और उनकी हॉरिजॉन्टल नेचर जो है वो ज्यादा हो रही है. इसलिए जरूरत इस बात की बढ़ गई है कि कम्युनिकेशन जो है वो इंटरैक्टिव नेचर में ज्यादा अवेलेबल हो रही है, ज्यादा कम्युनिकेशन इंटरैक्टिव होती चली जा रही है. इसका यह मतलब नहीं है कि तमाम ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो हैं वो पिरामिड या ट्रायंगल की तरह नहीं रही, या ये कि अब उनमें अपवर्ड या डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन नहीं रही, बल्कि इसका मतलब यह है कि अब इंटरैक्टिव कम्युनिकेशन आहिस्ता आहिस्ता बढ़ती चली जा रही है. और इंटरैक्टिव कम्युनिकेशन जो है उसके ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी पर बहुत से असरात पड़ रहे हैं. वो भी देखते हैं क्या असरात हैं ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी पर. इंटरैक्टिव कम्युनिकेशन की बिना पर प्रॉब्लम सॉल्विंग पहले से बेहतर हो रही है. अब लोग जल्दी और फ्रीली एक्सप्रेस करते हैं अपने आप को, बिकॉज द डाउनवर्ड नेचर एंड द अपवर्ड नेचर हैज बीन टेकन आउट of the paradigm of communication. So communication is taking place at the same level, therefore it is becoming more and more problem solving. Communication, which is interactive in nature, also is leading to information sharing. ज्यादा से ज्यादा लोग ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में एक दूसरे के साथ इंफॉर्मेशन शेयरिंग कर रहे हैं. Interactive communication also is impacting conflict resolution. मैंने आपको बताया कि upward और downward communication में problems हैं, लेकिन इंटरएक्टिव कम्युनिकेशन जो है, अब उसमें उसकी वजह से वो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट रेजोल्यूशन जो है वो कम होती चली जा रही है। तो इंटरएक्टिव कम्युनिकेशन का एक ये भी असर हुआ है कि वो इंटरपर्सनल, इंटरग्रुप, इंट्रापर्सनल, इंट्राग्रुप कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स को रिजॉल्व करने में बहुत मददगार माविन साबित हो रही है। सो दैट इज व्हाट interactive communication is about. We've talked about 3 types of communication in organization so far: downwards, upwards, and more recent, interactive communication. इससे आगे भी थोड़ा सा चलते हैं और देखते हैं कि कम्युनिकेशन का मुख्तलिफ कल्चर्स पर क्या असर है, या यूं समझिए, we need to now study communication across cultures. Why should we study communication across cultures? What is the need for that? Because, as I said earlier on, चलिए आप बताइए पहले, what is the need for anybody to, in organizational psychology, to study communication across cultures? Can you guess? You have guessed right. You see, organizations are becoming MNCs, multinational corporations. They are expanding across various regions and across various geographical regions and across different cultures. One organization, Organization A, for instance, has its operations in Asia, Africa, North America, Europe. A European organization has its operations in Africa and Asia. A North American organization has its operations in Asia, South Asia, Africa, Australia, everywhere. All of these have different cultures. All of these regions have different cultures. In order for an organization to improve within organization communication, it needs to study various cultural compulsions, and that is why we need to take a look at communication across culture. इसमें 2-3 बातें देखने वाली हैं कि communication across cultures may have certain breakdowns or certain barriers. Let us take a look at those barriers or obstacles or hindrances, and if you as organizational psychologists can help to remove those hindrances, then communication across cultures would improve. Okay? What are those barriers that we need to look at? Number 1, the problem of perceptions, what we call perceptual problems in communication. There would be different meanings attached to different words and gestures in one culture, in one geographical region, and different meanings would be attached to, are attached to certain words and certain gestures in another culture, in another geographical region. The difference in meanings, the difference in meaning of gestures are what we call perceptual problems. Shaking hands between males and females, addressing persons by first names is not similar across cultures. In American culture, if you are addressed by the first name, that is considered a part of friendly gesture. In our culture, if you address somebody who's senior to you by his first name, that would be considered a sign of disrespect. You see the difference in perceptions? That is one problem that may arise in communication across cultures, that there are different perceptions related to different meanings different symbols, different ways of communicating. That's one problem. Another problem is that of stereotyping, or what we call stereotypical problems. People attach negative meanings, negative connotations to certain words, to certain other people, to certain other ideologies, to certain other objects, to certain other animals, depending upon their cultural belongingness. In the North American and European continents, certain animals are not considered bad for eating. In the Asian subcontinent, certain animals are not to be eaten at all under any circumstances. You can't even pronounce their name. आप जानते हैं कि हमारे मुल्क में भी उसको बाहर वाला कहा जाता है. गांव में अगर आप जाएं तो लोग उस जानवर का नाम नहीं लेते, उसे कहते हैं बाहर वाला, because this is considered a bad animal. Whereas in European or American cultures, this is not so bad. We consider certain people to be bad in any case. For instance, certain people whom we would consider to be outside of our religious circles would be considered bad. Whereas in other cultures, they may not be considered bad. So we have this problem in communication where certain things and people and objects are stereotyped. And these stereotypes are different across different regions and different cultures. Therefore, when communication takes place, that stereotyping comes into operation, comes into play. Another problem related to communication across cultures is the problem of exactly opposite of stereotyping, that is halo effecting. Halo effecting is considering these certain other persons or ideologies or groups or people to be superior. In the Asian culture, generally, a boss is considered superior. In the North American or European culture, boss is not necessarily considered superior. So this is another difference in communication, which we call the halo affecting difference or the halo affecting problem, that may impact, that may influence communication across cultures. और आखिरी इस सिलसिले में जो problem है, that is the problem of what we call ethnocentric problem. Ethnocentric problem relates to considering yourself superior and others to be inferior. If in a culture the training is to consider your own self to be superior and others to be inferior, that is a problem that is called ethnocentric problem. The problem of perceptions, the problem of stereotyping, the problems of halo affecting, and the problem of ethnocentricity impact communication across cultures. And these problems have to be overcome, these hindrances have to be removed if across-culture communication has to be improved. Across-cultural communication has to be improved because any given organization is a multinational organization or is moving towards multinational organizations. What can you do? What can be done? What psychologists suggest to improve cross-cultural communication? 2-3 तरीके उन्होंने बताए हैं जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो हैं आजकल अपनाए हुए हैं. One called the cultural assimilators. People are provided training, people are given information to familiarize them with the problems, with the situation, with the peculiarities, with the characteristics of other cultures, so that people belonging to one region and one culture, belonging to the same organization, become familiar with problems of, the nature of, the characteristics of, the cultures of the same organization in other regions. Training is provided. This is called cultural assimilator programs. एक और तरीका जो है, that is using historical and cultural and other materials in terms of taped television programs, in terms of books, periodicals that are provided to people so that they get familiarized with the culture of other people, with the culture of other region, which may be a part of the same organization, and thus can know what is considered right and what is considered wrong, what is considered negative and what is considered positive in other regions, in other cultures. Taped materials, television programs, books, periodicals, journals, newspapers, gazettes, all of these are provided so that people in an organization may familiarize themselves with the culture of another region. और ये भी एक तरीका इख्तियार किया गया है कि मियाँ बीवी दोनों को, if a person is working in an organization, the wife and the husband both are exposed and trained to the cultural requirements of the other region. Why should the wife, if the husband is working in an organization, why should the wife get the training? Why should the wife also be familiar with the cultural peculiarities of another region? Because husband and wife are ultimately a team. And they have to function as a team. And the function would improve if the team is trained as a unit. And that is what modern organizational psychologists are doing. Modern organizational psychologists have realized that communication may break down across cultures because it has a number of problems. Modern organizational psychologists have realized that organizations have to be multicultural. Therefore, they have adopted ways and means. They have suggested ways and means. They have started training workshops. They have started cultural assimilators. And they have started training both husband and wives so that communication across cultures may not break down. Before we end today, let us quickly recap what we talked about. We talked about 3 types of communication in an organization: upward communication, downward communication, and interactive communication. We talked about peculiarities, we talked about its problems, and we talked about how those problems and peculiarities may be tackled. Then we talked about communication across cultures. We talked about what barriers could there be in communication across cultures, and we then touched upon how those barriers in communication across cultures may be removed. Do look up these things and do understand well. You might be in a multinational organization very soon. Until then, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.